All right, joining me now on the Matthew Filipowicz show is Chris Bowers. Chris was formerly of MyDD and Open Left, of course, and he is currently the campaign director at Daily Kos, which you can find at dailykos.com. Chris, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
All right, so Chris, you recently wrote a great post at Daily Kos entitled, "You Can't Win a Class War Unless We Fight One." So tell us, Chris, because even though there definitely is a class war going on, most Americans don't seem to either be aware of it or fighting it.
Well, it starts when you think about the current debt ceiling fight that's happening in Washington, D.C. And what's happening there is that a bunch of rich and powerful people are working to decide not whether to cut spending programs that are designed to help the low and middle income Americans, but how much they should cut them by. And when you think further that they're doing this in order to figure out how to pay for tax breaks, which they recently gave to large corporations and to wealthy individuals, and that they're doing it at the behest of lobbying organizations and media operations, which are run by other rich and powerful people. And that just sounds to me like a straight-up class war as to what's happening there. And, sadly and depressingly, this is something that it doesn't seem like there's a huge amount of fight back on. I mean, there definitely is fight back on, and I don't want to, be derogatory towards anyone who is attempting to stop that fight that's going on in D.C. It's just that right now there's such an overwhelming force pushing in that direction in D.C. that it doesn't seem like there's any way to keep it from happening. It's more of a question of how much it happens by rather than if it happens. And a further disconcerting fact is that, I'm 37 years old, and this is something that's been happening for as long as I've been alive. This is by no means the first time in recent decades where people have looked to cut programs for the low and middle and middle class in order to pay for what are historically low tax rates on the wealthy and on corporations. And it's been going on for decades, and the class war is basically being fought, and in DC it's very one-sided.
Yeah. Why do you it's kind of hard to say this, but psychologically, why do you think people seem to not be aware of it? Is it something that they just don't get? Do you think it's something that I know there's all this idea of the American dream that like, oh, I don't want to have taxes on the rich because one day I might be rich, I might win the lottery or something like that. I mean, why do you think this actually that people don't seem to be more up in arms about what's clearly going on?
I think people are aware of what's going on, and that that there's fewer and fewer people who are fighting for them on a national level. I think my suspicion, and I don't have a thoroughly researched set of numbers to back this up, but my very strong suspicion is not that people are like they're aware of it. They just don't believe that it's ever going to change, and they don't really believe that there's going to be anyone who's going to stand up and not only fight for them, but who's going to actually accomplish something for them in Washington, D.C. And so my feeling is that it's more a sense of resignation that, this is, the way it's been, this is the way it's always going to be, and I'm just going to have to try to make do by myself as best I can in response to that.
Yeah. In your post, you actually you put a chart that had been on Daily Kos before about all these different program cuts. And if people don't think there is a class war going on, one, they're not paying attention. But like things like $11.2 billion for early childhood programs are being cut. But then for a tax break for the wealthy, there's $11.5 billion for millionaires' estates. Cut and the list just goes on and on of what we're actually giving up as far as programs in exchange for these programs that benefit like the upper 1% of the entire country.
Yeah, that chart was actually referring to the previous major spending fight in D.C., which only took place about 3 months ago. But it was the fight to try to find spending cuts to prevent a government shutdown back in March and April. And that fight was almost exactly the same as this one, where there was a demand to cut programs designed to help low and middle income Americans in order to pay for tax breaks that were just given to wealthy individuals and large corporations only a few months earlier when the Bush tax cuts were extended. And it's a pattern that we see time and time again. I guess it doesn't always turn out like this. There are some moments where sometimes it works in the other direction. And even though many people, myself included, were frustrated with how far the Affordable Care Act went and thought that it should go much further, that was at least one circumstance where there was money that was being charged to higher income Americans, and it was being used to go into subsidies for people to help afford health insurance. And so, like, that was one rare example where it was moving in the other direction. And we all saw how even that sort of meager example of it was such an incredible push. It was such a bear just to get that one thing done in the other direction. And I think that gives us a good indication of the disproportionate forces lined up on different sides of this class war.